Welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed a nice break and you were able to refresh so we can get started with the next part of the programming. And as part of this symposium, we're going to have a panel of different representative perspectives, some from here in the San Luis Valley, some from around the state. But before we head off to our panel, I just wanted to be able to highlight, the background that I have working right now, as the beautiful video that Angie and Rio showed during our break and prior to the start of the symposium. The San Luis Valley has beautiful, beautiful landscapes and scenes, and a lot of that is due to some of the agriculture that we have in production. The backgrounds that I'm going to use today are backgrounds that we have from our personal ranch and farm, and so with that, we're very proud. We're very passionate, all of us here in the San Luis Valley and the citizens of the San Luis Valley. We want to show off that we're not wasting water, we're using water. And so, Dan, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, that hopefully our panel can show all those productive ideas and perspectives that they have in how we're going to use this water.
Great, thanks. And I'm glad to help out and help facilitate this discussion today. I think we have a really interesting group of people and an interesting panel today. So just to get us started a little bit, we're going to ask each panelist to give just a 5-minute introduction. But before we do that, I just wanted to throw out a warm-up question, mostly so we get each and everybody's voice in here from the very get-go. But I want you to answer the question, what do you love most about the San Luis Valley and the Rio Grande? And this was the answer to this question is, if you said winter, this was where you could get some extra bonus points. So I'm just going to go around as the people pop up on my screen. So Armando, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start off, Dan. Thank you. So the San Luis Valley, I love fall and winter. So I don't know if that gets me any bonus points, but fall is the absolute best. I think we have the best season here in the fall. Spring, there's too much work. So we're lucky to be here this morning instead of outside working. The San Luis Valley is great for many reasons. For me, it's about culture. It's about lifestyle. It's about heritage. I tell people that I had family that came up in the early 1600s into the Santa Fe area, and then in those 1860s came up into the San Luis Valley. So for 400 years, we don't travel very far. We've gone about 90 miles during that time frame, but I can still put my hand in the ground and feel that length of heritage. And so for me, being here in the San Luis Valley is about protecting these resources, being good stewards of it, and ensuring that it's here for a future generation.
Great, thank you, Armando. George, what do you love the most about the San Luis Valley?
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I guess my story is not quite as old as Armando's, but goes back quite a ways. My grandfather came here in 1893 and settled on a piece of land not more than a half a mile from where I'm sitting right now, and so we've been in this area for a long time. And my story is kind of one of two grandfathers. My grandfather, who settled here in 1893, was a teacher and a pastoralist, and he settled on land that didn't have a lot of water, but they were able to drill these little small artesian wells and make a place for the stock to drink and live out here on the north end of the valley. And my other grandfather was an engineer. Basically, he never had any formal training, but he was a guy who could take old Model Ts and Model A cars and tear them all apart and put them back together. And he devised some well rigs that would drill 1,000 feet deep, a 16-inch hole with no formal engineer training, but he was a genius at working with machinery and making stuff work. And he brought a wealth that nobody ever knew was here, and guys like him, they drilled all those wells back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and we created this whole economy based on those wells that at that time no one, like you were mentioning a while ago, Dan, engineering is a very specific problem solve. And so now here we are at this moment in time when we have to deal with the impacts of that technology and what that did to our environment and to our communities. And so we are at the crux of that right now. And added to that, we have climate change. We have a lot of things going on make our a lot more demand for the water, that kind of thing. And so here we are. So that's me.
Right. I think you just threw the engineers under the bus.
Well,
That's all right. So James, what do you love most about the San Luis Valley? What
You know,
keeps
the valley has a tremendous sense of place. You know, when I talk to farmers from the Midwest and, you know, folks from the city, and I tell them I can wake up and look out my window and see 50 to 100 miles in every direction, they do not have ability to comprehend that. Just the topography of where we live is amazing, and it gives you a very comforting feeling to know that Mount Blanca is always in the same place. And you know, there's a consistency that I really appreciate that. And Armando mentioned the culture, the people are, you know, salt of the earth folks, and really appreciate them. We have our little squabbles internally, but when we're pressed from the outside, we unite and we really stick together, which I really appreciate. And just the tie that our folks in the valley have to the land, just they're humble because of that. Farming in a desert makes people humble, and I really appreciate that.
Great. Thank you, James. Kelsey?
Yeah, I suppose as a sociologist, I'm supposed to say the people, and that is true. But you know, when I first moved to the valley, the reason that I did so was exactly for what James just mentioned, that sense of place. I had come through the valley on a road trip, and I just remember looking around and just having my breath taken away from me, and some draw that I cannot explain, that I knew someday I was going to come back and live there. And so I did. And, you know, now having moved away from the valley and lived in other parts of Colorado, I live in Pueblo currently. The thing that I miss most about the valley is that feeling when you wake up in the morning and the smell, the mist. Yeah, that's what I miss. And the sound of the birds, that view, that's what I love the most about the valley. And every time I get to go back, that is what I look forward to every night when I go to bed.
Oh, thanks, Kelsey. Jenny, what's your perspective? What do you love about the valley as somebody who doesn't live in the valley?
Well, I'm not lucky enough to live in the valley, but so I see it as a visitor. And I was a sociology undergrad major, and it's not because of that, but it is true. It is the people, right? I remember the very first water tour we took there, and Rio especially was like, well, come back, stay with me. You have to just come be here. And I'm like, oh yeah, I will. You've also had some great legislators, right? I loved working with Larry Crowder. I'm very excited that Cleve is coming in now to be a good partner in water. Ed Vigil was my mentor as the chair of ag when I came in. Just wonderful people. I'm also a runner, so I like your running program down there. The other thing I liked is, I'm not sure if Levita is technically in the valley or not, but I do a lot of civility discourse training with other legislators around the country. And they were reading a book in their book club, and they saw my name in this National Institute of Civil Discourse site. And this is what I love. They just called me. Well, let's call her. She lives in Colorado. And they said, would you come down and talk to our book club? I go, oh, yeah, I'll drive down. I go, that's the sort of like openness and ability to make connections and type of initiative that is just, I said, can I bring my mom? They're like, oh yeah, bring your mom, spend the weekend. We're going to talk about this book. So I had to quick order the book. And it's just that type of refreshing openness. And it's just, I love it. And I wish I could live there, but I'm stuck right here.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jenny. So let's get into this a little bit. So we're going to have each one of our panelists take 5 minutes and talk about what's going on in the valley. What we see, you know, I'm living in the Grand Valley, and we see a lot of pressures on agricultural water, and we're seeing now hedge funds coming in and buying up farms ostensibly. I don't think they're really interested in farming. I think they're interested in the water, of course. But if I could ask each panelist to just take 5 minutes, share what you see going on this issue of water and land, and possibility of speculation taking place or starting to take place, or the potential for that. And give everybody just 5 minutes to go through this. I think what I'd like to do is start with our, who didn't like the term agriculturists when we talked. So I'm not going to use that term, James. Our farmers and ranchers, and then we'll have Kelsey offer her perspective, and then Jenny. I think it's important to kind of give the bigger picture, what's going on from the state perspective. So, George, would you start us off and just give us 5 minutes and share what you see is going on, and your views and thoughts about it?
Well, water has been basically my life, and the life, everybody in my family has been involved in water issues all from the time they came here. I had an uncle who was a state water engineer back in the 50s, and so we've been very active in water. But what I've seen is that, and I'm we're always living in the present, but I look to the past and I look to the future, and I always try to take the long view and figure out what is the best way. How are we actually going to be sustainable? How are we going to make this work? And what I see is that there's been a great focus on technology and on efficiency, and now we're looking at speculation as a, and I think people have always been speculators. The Rio Grande canals, the Monte Vista Canal, the Centennial canals, those were all built by speculators from back east who surveyed those canal systems out and developed agricultural properties. So those were developed on speculation. And then those big diversions out of the Rio Grande, later we had to acknowledge and deal with the interstate compact, because those diversions had big impacts on downstream water users. And at the time, nobody took that into account. And so we developed a culture and an economy based on those big diversions. And then when that became a problem and we realized we had to pay downstream uses, we developed the Closed Basin Project to try and mitigate that, where we took what seemed to be groundwater that was being evapotranspirated and not put to beneficial use, and put that in the river and allow ourselves to divert more into the canals and try and maintain our agricultural community. And then in the 70s, we came along with center pivot irrigation, and the efficiencies, that engineered efficiency is a place where we began to irrigate many more acres with the same amount of water. And we developed an economy that was dependent on a water supply that at the same time was diminishing. And so as we got more and more efficient, we also were very efficient in dewatering the aquifer. And then that came to where there was an obvious impact on surface streams. And so here we are trying to mitigate that with the sub-district process and figure out where is the balance between that new engineered economy and that old pastoral and original economy, and how does that fit into the realities of our current existence.
Well, we've got just another couple minutes. What are you saying? What do you hear going on about what might be water speculation and properties and so forth for the water?
Well, there's always rumors, and of course not only rumors, but active RWR, the Renewable Water Resources now, who's just sort of the next iteration of AWDI and Gary Boyce and all those things. They're still there, they're still out there. And the demand on the Front Range is still growing every day. And we are setting on what some people consider to be this huge aquifer that, and the history of a Western water law is you have to put water to use to make it beneficial. And that's part of the thing that's, you know, you have to use your water in order to claim it. You can't leave it in the stream and you can't leave it in the aquifer. And so that particular part of Western water law has caused a lot of what we see here, where first of all, it pits one ranch against the other. If you take the Saguache Creek, for instance, those ranches from the very beginning were basically pitted against one another based on their priority in the stream. And so there's been arguments for 150 years over who was in priority when, and you have to use all of your water when it's your turn. You can't leave it in the stream and expect to get credit for that. And it's the same thing with groundwater. The more you pump, the more you have credit for. And so that's a place in the law that we are trying to deal with, that I think that's one of the things that we need to really look at. And that leads to speculation. So how much water is there, and how can I get credit for that? And how can I sell that credit then to somebody else? And so, you know, we're using an economic model to make decisions. One of the problems with our subdistrict is we don't have all of the tools to work on this. A lot of this is a social and cultural argument, but really we can apply fees or we can cut our pumping, but we don't have a lot of other tools to work with. And so the structure that we're working under makes it very difficult to come to a real solution that is both socially and culturally effective and also gets us towards sustainability. And that's what I'm looking for.
Great. Thanks, George. Appreciate that. Armando?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, George. In looking at how we look, especially the future, as George indicated, I think it is a long game. It is looking towards the future of how we're going to use this resource. But I got a very early lesson in life about how water can leave. And once that resource is gone, it's gone. Our farm when my home residence is right on the Alamosa River. And the Alamosa River, when I was young, used to flow, year round in the wintertime, definitely throughout the spring and summer. And there'd always be a trickle in there. And now the Alamosa River will go completely dry. And I can remember being probably about 10 or 11 years old when it started to go dry. And that was a whole change of complexion for our ranch, for our ecosystem, in how we manage livestock. And so that definitely was that reality check of this is finite. There's not an unlimited amount. It's not always going to flow. And it is beautiful when it flows. Water, not only it has a beauty to it, but then there's also those other components of the economic components that's very important to individuals who own it. I'm very honored and privileged to represent Conejos County on the Rio Grande Water Conservation District. And so in that position, I'm very fortunate to see how water is impacted, not only in my area, my backyard, and my county, but all over the San Luis Valley. And I know the process of the groundwater rules that Craig talked about earlier can cause a lot of anxiety, and the subdistricts themselves can cause a lot of stress and anxiety. One thing positive I think we can say about that process is that it's community and community decisions and representative decisions of individuals who this issue is directly impacting have a say. It's a very decentralized approach. It's not the Rio Grande Water Conservation District coming in and telling each subdistrict what they should do. There's a board of managers that represent different interests within that particular area. And I think that's a positive we have to look at with our community. The other positive I think we have to look at is we're given time to kind of work through maybe some solutions that help solve some of these issues. It wasn't just one day you're on and then next day you're off. There is some time frame that we can get some consensus building and work together on how do we develop use and management and administration of our water resource. I know sub-district number 1, as Craig indicated with some of his graphs, look a little scary, and they've looked a little scary for a few years, and they're running against a timeline, as Craig indicated. But there are representative interests that, again, decentralized. It's farmers and ranchers in those areas that, having this problem impact them, make decisions. We heard about their challenges. We heard about the challenges with sub-district number 5, not being able to have a sufficient ARP, partial ARP, which was going to go into place on March 15th and cover them to, I believe, was it May 1st, I believe, George, when that ARP did not cover. And then, so they're working right now, making decisions as we speak, trying to find solutions so then it doesn't stop them from using water resources, specifically groundwater, in the next irrigation year from May 1st to next April 30th. And so there are these challenges which are out there. But just like we think of private property rights as a bundle of sticks, you hear the legal perspective always about it. And part of your perspective are the mineral rights, the water rights, the surface rights, the air rights. There's all these different components. Well, water is also layered there too. It's tough for me to say to a farmer or rancher who sees that as an economic resource that, hey, you can't sell it because selling it might impact, the ecosystem, or might impact wildlife habitat, or it might impact the community, because for that farmer or rancher, that may be their retirement plan. We don't have maybe a whole lot of 401ks that are out there on farm and ranches. And so some of it is how they transfer some of those resources. Another one of those levels becomes that future generational interest. Well, if we expend and lose all of our resource now, do we end up like the poster child for this, Crowley County, to where there's no economic future? What happens to the lifestyle? James talked a little bit about it, being able to go look out his window, see these landscapes. But I go out and I don't just see a high valley or high desert valley that's growing nothing but some of those prairie grasses. You see the image behind me, there's green, lots of green, because we're able to divert it and build, an economic value, but a lifestyle value as well. And then there's the community connection. George talked about this as being part of his family for many generations. It is truly lifeblood, and we feel so connected to this water that I think there are challenges that start to threaten all of those different interests that we have. So as we look in having a symposium like we're having today, it is bringing together this meeting of the minds, as they say in legal terms, trying to find out, how do we find out outcomes and solutions that help sustain this? That word sustainability that George talked about, I think, is so important. One other thing that maybe we don't take into consideration, and my final point that I'll make is, if agriculture did not exist here in the San Luis Valley, and diversions did not happen off of the Rio Grande or some of these other river systems, think of how Alamosa might look. Alamosa might be flooded every year, and it'd have a completely different complexion. What would it be if there wasn't that economic base that's available for people to live? And so coming in, the Sequia system was implemented. So you see that Spanish Moorish influence from the very beginning. When people came, they saw these water rivers and creeks that were happening. The first thing they thought about is, how do I sustain a life here? And how do I divert it and to produce something that can build communities? And I think we're back to that point again. How do we look at this resource, and how do we work to build communities? I think that's essential as we work forward, is how do we look at all those facets? But ultimately, I think it does come down to, how do we build a strong, viable, sustainable community for the future?
Great. Thanks very much, Armando.
Yes.
James?
Yeah, it's good to listen to everybody's perspective, and I would agree with the majority of what George and Armando said. I remember being 11 years old and being at Sky High Park with an AWDI sign with a circle and a slash through it, just as a kid, holding that up, not really understanding the full implication of why my grandpa wanted me there. And, several years down the road, I understand what he was trying to, I think, imprint on his posterity about, the value of water and the value of keeping it in the community. It's a very, very difficult problem. There's the cultural aspect. There's the fact that I really like what I do in producing food and for people, and I think that is a benefit to the people of Colorado the way we do use the resource. I think the pandemic that we've had really awakened a lot of people to the importance of regional food systems as well. And, you know, the value that we provide to the people of Colorado, again, with their resource. You know, with that being said, we have to operate in reality as well. There's multiple things coming to bear at once. We're hundreds of thousands of acre feet short of where we were in the Rio Grande Basin, you know, 100 years ago, as far as just flows at the upper indexes. We're hundreds of thousands of acre feet short of where we were in aquifers. The Front Range is expanding at a rate that I can barely comprehend. You know, every time I either fly into Denver or drive from the valley up to Denver, it's amazing. It just seems like there's a new subdivision every other week. That's a reality that we are going to have to deal with. And it's very complex. Now, you also have to understand, or we have to understand, that, you know, a lot of our water is tied up in agriculture. And agriculture is becoming increasingly less sustainable from a profitability standpoint. We're doing very good taking care of our land, our water, and making it better for the next generation, and learning more and more about that every time. But as decreased profitability continues to put more pressure onto our farmers and ranchers who have an asset, sometimes there has to be a way out. And that's kind of what Armando talked about. If we could get more cash into the pockets of farmers and ranchers, some of these decisions would be a lot easier. And that just kind of makes this very complex stew in which we have to operate in. So just, you know, tying water to the land in perpetuity or something like that doesn't always solve those problems. And I would also say that especially here in the valley, we have increased pressure simply from the fact that we've got to match our water resource to the land. And that's the challenge that's in front of the sub-districts. Land is going to go out of production. And, you know, you put all of that together and then you get a renewable water resources, and it becomes very, very difficult to have those conversations. We're going to continue, in my opinion. I've been on the West Slope for the last 3 days talking to farmers and ranchers in Meeker and Hotchkiss, and I'm actually in Durango right now, which I don't know if that's allowed to talk about the Rio Grande on the banks of the Los Animas, but here I am. But the Colorado River has such an impact, what's going on there with what's going to happen in the valley and within other basins. The Colorado River really is going to influence what occurs in pressuring other basins to sell water, because the Colorado River has such a huge challenge in front of it. And so I think we have to have that operational reality and understand. And so where I would go with that is the diverse water interest within the San Luis Valley. We need to get together in the spirit of self-determination and understand what our comfort level is and what that would look like. Right now, I feel like Renewable Water Resources is trying to, you know, with their surveying and with their advertising and some of those things, they're trying to force a framework onto the water users of the San Luis Valley. And I think we need to gather up in a spirit of self-determination and understand what that would look like. We really also need to develop and understand how we can use ATMs, alternative transfer methods, to meet those demands. I think everybody understands what the permanent loss of water looks like for a community. We need to make sure that we are developing good programs which farmers can be compensated for leasing, renting, developing water in a way that isn't a permanent buy and dry. Buy and dry is catastrophic. and we need to avoid it at any cost. And I think there's ways, but it's going to take the water users, the water right owners, and the municipalities, the legislature, all getting together to determine, and state engineer, to determine how we do that in a way that's beneficial to our communities and respects and maintains the water rights that are a property right.
Great. Thank you, James. It's very interesting. Kelsey?
Yeah, so one of the things that I do in my other spare time is I teach sociology. And one of the questions I like to ask my students is, have you ever been in a situation where you thought you knew what people were talking about, and all of a sudden you realize, wait, I have no clue what anyone's saying. We're saying these words, and I'm supposed to know what these words mean, but I don't think we're talking about them in the same way. And so one of the things that I am really interested in my own research is finding those situations where we think we're having the same conversation, but we're talking past each other. And what is at the root of those missed communications, those misalignments? And, you know, to know that you're having a conversation. I remember when I first started learning more about water, my indoctrination into Colorado water law was in the San Luis Valley. And I was very fortunate to have quite a few mentors who guided me and taught me these things. But, you know, as I have continued doing more and more research, I've realized that a lot of times in the water world, we're having conversations where we assume we all know what we're talking about, but we're defining these words differently or understanding these words differently. We're operating from different assumptions about the way that things are or the way that the world works. And that's not a problem. That's one of the benefits of Colorado water, is that there are so many different perspectives. But it's also important to step back and acknowledge, like, okay, what are we talking about here? And it can be as simple as, you know, asking, well, okay, how are you understanding sustainable in this conversation? These are, you know, especially the word sustainable is used a lot. And generally, you know, we have a good idea of what that means. But for instance, you know, in subdistrict number 1, sustainable has a very specific meaning that is linked to a level of success that needs to be achieved. But then when we talk about sustainable communities, you know, it starts to get way more nebulous. You know, what do we mean when we say we want to have a sustainable community? And having those conversations about what that then looks like, and asking questions, well, sustainable for who? That's one of the things that I really try to do in my work, which my work is a lot of listening. And one of the things that I want to ask people is to kind of go back to those basic assumptions. You know, what does sustainable look like? Or what is efficiency? You know, George talked about the term efficiency and being efficient. And in different contexts, that can have very different meanings. And so instead of always, you know, coming to conversations and assuming that we're all starting from the same place, it's important to kind of take that step back and make sure that everyone is on the same page. We get lulled into this comfortability, and especially people who have been having conversations like these for a long time, we tend to forget that, you know, we move into the future with these assumptions that we're all going at the same pace, and we're not. So not only do, you know, words like sustainable, efficiency can have different meanings, but also words like value. Value is such a like, oh, what are we talking about here? Whenever I hear that word come out, because there's economic value, and that is a very real, visceral thing. Like Armando talked about, there is an economic value to water that is defined very differently depending on where you're coming from and what your relationship to that water is and what your interests around water are. And certainly in the hundreds of interviews that I've had the privilege to do with farmers and ranchers, both in the Rio Grande, in the Arkansas, and the Colorado River Basin, I have rarely come across a water user, a farmer or a rancher who does not have a very emotional connection to the work that they do. And, there's a complex relationship that people have with water when it funds their livelihood. And, that's going to be a very different relationship to water than, for instance, a municipal manager has, who also sees value in that water, but in a very different way. Or even the general public in Colorado that is not familiar with farming or ranching or water management, that just is able to turn on their tap and have a glass of water come out, or if you put the glass there first. And so thinking about the way that we talk about value, especially for things like water, is so dependent on what your relationship is to that water. And so when thinking about disagreements or, a lot of those underlying logics that frame how we make decisions, it's really important to step back and try to understand where different people are coming from in terms of their relationship to water. And I think Dan kind of talked a lot about that in his initial presentation, that, interests you need to look for those interests rather than positions. And, as a sociologist, what I've really seen is that positions can shape your interests and you can find shared interests, but they don't determine them. And so, thinking about the ways that others relate to water not only can help us understand how to have these conversations, but then defining these things, defining these key terms to see okay, what kind of assumptions are we all operating under? And so then when it comes to questions about things like speculation, asking these questions can help really illuminate what is the fear here, what is the major concern, and then also how do we move forward when we have different interests, and then where do those interests align? I think that one of the things that this kind of exercise can really do is make the seemingly obvious or the seemingly normal weird and curious, and that's where a lot of interests can be found. There are, a lot of interests that can be pretty surprising when we start asking those questions. In my work, I've seen a lot of very interesting partnerships, whether it's between ag and environmental interests, people sharing interests around water flows in the river. That benefits everyone. And then also in the Arkansas River Basin, there's partnerships around augmentation water between municipality and farms. And so there's diverse ways to find those shared interests that really can benefit everyone. But it's also important to acknowledge that these things don't happen in a vacuum, and they can have very real costs for people. And so again, that comes back to looking at those relationships to water and how we're defining value of water.
Thanks, Kelsey. So Jenny, just wrap this all up, put a nice big package with that statewide perspective.
Just solve it. Should I just solve this? Thank you very much. And Kelsey, you made me laugh with your opening comment that have you ever had a conversation where you're not talking about the same thing? I've come down to the Capitol one day. That's my life all the time, right? And that's a challenge. I think I always get nervous when I talk to water groups because I'm not a water lawyer or engineer. I know about the politics of water. And I think what I can talk to you about, we did the anti-speculation is just a working group, and the report's coming up next August. That's not going to change the world. And it's against our Constitution to speculate now, but it is good to highlight that. Another thing, just to show you some of the challenges at the Capitol, and I know there are many. I did a land water use planning bill, and I know we all like to be very independent in Colorado, and I'm part of that whole thing too. We don't like mandates. I come from a home rule city. No thank you very much. Do not tell me what to do. All this bill said was, you may look at water when you're doing a master plan. May. It's not even, I go, you guys, this isn't really even a law. It took 2 years to pass that, right? But if we don't get serious, and I'm talking about the Front Range, if we don't do master planning at the municipal and county level, to make sure when you approve a development, that person or that group has a plan for their water. They've just been approving this willy-nilly. Oh, we'll worry about the water later. Well, I forget, James said it. You know, I'm from Fort Collins since almost birth, right? 3 weeks old. You know, I don't even know where I live. Half the time I'm like, Mom, I'm lost in South Fort Collins again. She's like, I know, I gotta get out of here. It's very, that's how much it's grown, right? And we all know that. But that's a challenge. If a bill like that says May, that's not really even has any teeth in it at all, takes 2 years, right? Like this light bulb has not gone on yet in many places, so that's one point. The other point with term limits, we need you guys so much, right? The water knowledge at the Capitol was not very broad when I got there, and I would say it's waning, right? A complex topic like this is where your communication with your local legislator and your water groups weighing in is absolutely critical moving forward. Thank goodness we have Cleve now. Don Quorum's been involved in water for a while, Jerry Sonnenberg, myself. And honestly, that's the, and then we have the water committee, and against my strong objection, it was canceled last summer. And so we lost the eyes and ears of the legislature and the input on different issues coming into us. I hope we never do that again. So I, just as another example of, there is a very complicated mutual ditch issue that had been in court for 10 years. You know, I don't know how to solve that other than to stick everybody in a room. And they met for 6 or 7 weeks for 3 hours every Wednesday. And they said, you guys, I'm pretty agnostic on this because I'm not a mutual ditch owner, but I know enough about water politics to say, if you come to us with an agreement that has everyone at neutral or in favor, it'll pass. And that's what happened on Monday. It was unanimous out of committee. It'll be unanimous out of, oh, and we have Mark Catlin, of course, too. And we're very happy to have him as my water partner in the House. And that's how I think when the water community wants to get things done, I really would suggest that that's what you do. It's going to be a do-it-yourselfer. I wouldn't, that was an example of kind of as best as it gets in my view. Not everyone got what they wanted, but they're going to get that bill through. So that's my plea to you all. Help us, communicate with us, invite us, show us. And then if you need a change in legislation, and we will need more changes, as you've all talked about, it's just math, finite resource, a changing climate, and increased population. We're going to have pushes coming to shove, right? The ATMs need to be workable, and we need to, wherever there's a legislative fix, and I hope we can all come together and solve it that way. That's all we need you.
Be careful what you ask for, Jenny.
Well, I was, so I know I need you.
Gosh, this is kind of blowing my mind a little bit. I wish I could spend the whole afternoon sitting down with all of you. Such interesting perspectives. I'm not quite sure where to begin here, but let me throw out one thing for you all to ponder here for the next few minutes. But maybe one of your panelists said something that really brought up a question for you or something else you wanted to chime in. So think about if there's something you want to ask somebody else or the other panelists based on what people have said here. And I guess while you're thinking about that, let me just throw one question out here and see how people might respond. And James, I had thought about this before, but what you had to say really reminded me about this again. And you know, my perspective is living here in the Grand Valley, where we're seeing a hedge fund that now, for example, is the largest shareholder under the Grand Valley Water Users System, and that's the biggest ditch company in the Grand Valley. It's really changing things. But as folks have gone out and talked about this and looked at it, it seems like the issue is bookended on two ends that everybody can agree on. And on the one end, as you said, James, water is an economic commodity, and a farmer would be the first one to say, don't take away my ability to enter the marketplace with that water. And on the other end, that I think there's kind of broad agreement is, while we want a marketplace to work, we don't want an unfettered or unconstrained market. There needs to be sideboards to what we're doing on this issue of, I think the future is going to be reducing agricultural water use, and for so many reasons that you've talked about. But we don't want that to be a race to the bottom. We don't want it to be the least dollar kind of situation. We don't want it to be unconstrained. And so my question for each one of you is, what's the middle ground here? How do you land in the middle of something that doesn't violate either ends of that? And so I'm curious what your perspectives are. James, I'm going to maybe start with you because you started talking a little bit about ATMs, and maybe ATMs are a little bit of that middle ground, so that the water continues to be owned by the farmer. Its use is not perpetual, perhaps for other purposes. So, James, what's that middle ground? Can you say more about what that middle ground would look like from your perspective?
Yeah, and I think Jenny said it best when we're not real fond of mandates. And so we have to be real careful when it comes to property rights. And I think that's kind of a universal thing, whether it's a home rule city or it's a, your HOA, folks join the HOA, but sometimes they don't like what they have to say. And that kind of feeling, I think, translates over to what we do with our agricultural property rights, whether it's the land or the water. And that's kind of a fundamental United States cultural thing that I think is universal. What I believe has to happen is we have to start looking as a community, as a water community, as a value committee with a valley community, and identifying the values that we want to keep. And then how do we build a structure to have an alternative to the buy and dry? If we get together and we determine, which I universally hear, that buy and dry is bad, it's going to happen in some circumstances still, I believe, and it's going to happen to resolve some of our sustainability issues that we have in the aquifer and to augment stream flows and some of those things. There's going to be some of that, but I think we've got to come together and say, what structure can we create for farmers to have an option? What are the parameters around that? If water is going to leave the valley, let us be in charge, so that when the investment firms come in, they almost seem like they're wearing tinfoil hats because we've already resolved our own problem. I would challenge the thinking about speculation. I don't know if with the rate of growth on the Front Range, if you could ever make an argument that buying water right now is a speculative endeavor because of the rate of growth. And that's very concerning. We're going to be 10 million people by 2050, and that's a huge rate of growth. So I think that as community members, as water community members, we need to start having that, I hate to borrow a term from the West Slope, but a conceptual framework of what that looks like. What are the real parameters? Because I am a big fan of self-determination, and would like to see us go that route instead of having something happen to us. We're strong and proud people in the valley, and I want to make sure that we determine our future. One of the things that Armando and I have got our fingers in the soil and tied to the land, and George as well. And agriculture is going to look very different 50 years from now. The way my grandfather ran our farm and ranch is very different than the way we do. And that's economic pressure, that's increases in technology, that's a lot of different things. If you went to La Jara in the 30s, it would have been pea sheds and produce, and you can't find, peas and produce in Pinellas County on a large scale anymore. And these things change and they evolve, and we've just got to make sure that we create a structure that works for us to be able to adapt to that and to satisfy the needs of all the water users.
Thanks. Who else wants to weigh in on this question of what's the middle ground, short of still having a market but constraining it, and hopefully doing something that promotes sustainability for ag and for communities? Who wants to weigh in on this?
Dan, I'll jump in. I think there's great introductions and from a host of different perspectives. And one thing that I really want to find middle ground on, you talk about that middle ground, is first of all, I guess middle ground for James, it's okay to be in Durango as long as you didn't take any water with you. That's the first thing. The second thing is to Jenny, is you said you need us, we need you. I mean, we need front range partners, front range alliances, and working through this. We know there's a consolidation of decision makers in that population there, and we rely on each other. We're here producing food. James talked about that. We're very proud that we produce food not only for Colorado but the United States and for the world. There's products that come out of the San Luis Valley that go all over, and that's what all agricultural does. But I lived in Fort Collins for about 14 years myself, and I still have property there. And when I was living there, and I'm sure it's the same way now because it keeps growing, is I saw some of the richest soil, blackest, darkest soil that I'll never see here in the San Luis Valley being turned over and then leveled on top with concrete and asphalt. And it made me want to cry that here's another precious resource that I could never have in the San Luis Valley changing. And so I appreciate that you talked about that the water plan would have to be in place for new subdivisions, because I've always thought about our concept of extended use here in the valley, that we cannot take water and keep extending it to other property that it wasn't originally adjudicated or intended. I feel the same thing has to apply to sprawl and growth that's happening in the Front Range area, and because they constantly go looking for water, and where do they come? They come to our doorstep, and then that's where we have some of these conversations. The other factor is our climate is changing drastically. I mean, look at our snowpack and moisture levels, and just what I see over the last 20 years. The new millennium, the 2000s have already been deemed, this century has already been deemed the century of disasters. We're only 21 years in, and we've already had more natural disasters than all the other recorded history for any a century. And I think that's also something that we want to look at. How do we address, because we need each other. There's that alliance that the Front Range urban and suburban areas need agriculture, need rural areas, need rural communities, need that the values and lifestyles that we provide in combination and collaboration with the Front Range values and perspectives, and how do we find that reciprocity between the two? So I guess that's where I see some of that middle ground. We got to start generating more alliances, because if you have just a handful of legislators up there that really understand these issues and these concepts, I'll tell you, we're in trouble. And maybe not the Front Range, I'm talking about San Luis Valley, we're in trouble.
Great. Thanks, Armando. Who else wants to weigh in on this?
I can jump in real quick. And I just want to kind of emphasize what Armando just said. Something, as I mentioned in my intro, one of the things that I'm really interested in is where seemingly conflicting entities can find shared interests that can help advocate for each other. And I think this is, in my research, this has been one of the areas where middle ground can be found, but it's hard and it's complex, because again, you have to go back to those basic conversations. What is a non-negotiable for me or who I represent? And are there areas where I am willing to bend? And what would that look like? And, where is a stopping point for that? But, finding those shared interests can lead to really interesting bedfellows, and generating those alliances, identifying where your interests overlap, can be key to building coalitions that can help answer the question of what do we want to be as a state, as Colorado, as we move forward with all the varying pressures that are weighing down on us. And there hasn't, in my interviews, there probably hasn't been a single farmer or a rancher that I've talked to who hasn't felt that there is some element of a target on agricultural water, especially in Colorado. And that's a really crappy place to be coming from. That sense or that feeling weighs very, very heavily. And so finding and looking for and finding interests that are shared, I think is part of that in moving forward.
Yeah, thanks.
Dan, this is Rio here. I'm going to just pipe in. If I've been putting it in the pet chat, if people are putting great comments, but some of them are just going to the panelists. If you could be sure to make sure that the to box says to panelists and attendees so everybody can see these great comments that are coming in. So thanks.
Thanks. And Rio, I've been trying not to be distracted from what the panelists are saying by what's going into chat. But if you feel there's a comment that's coming in that you'd really like to highlight, if you could yank my chain somehow or another, that would be great.
Sure. I think I'll throw out something. We've heard a few references to the concerns about climate change and how that's going to be affecting all of these, and all the different values of water, from farming and ranching to recreation and wildlife and other environmental values. So maybe that's something some of the panelists would want to address. And we certainly saw that in the trends that Craig Cotton was showing us this morning.
Yeah, anybody have thoughts about climate change? Why doesn't change ever help?
I might pipe in there a little bit. I think change does help. And, believe it or not, given the place where we are with subdistrict number 5, and it seems like we failed and we don't have an annual replacement plan. And I have worked, I don't know how many hundreds of meetings we've gone to over the years. And unfortunately, in the last year with COVID, we couldn't have public meetings. And so that really set us back, because if you can't sit down in a room and look at people and take your mask off and talk to one another, it's really difficult. And so we lost a lot of trust, I think, in our community there. But I'm kind of glad that we are where we are, because right now I'm getting more input and more ideas, and people are coming up with what they think might be solutions than we've ever had before. They kind of just left it up to the 5 board members and the staff of the Water Conservation District, and everybody assumed that we would develop some sort of a plan, and we didn't. But we've got a lot of background, and I think we, like I say, I'm kind of happy with where we are. I think it's time to take a big breath, step back, and let's determine what's really valuable here. We talked about values. Kelsey mentioned now what a big word that is. In the Saguache Creek Basin, we have one large farm that belongs to an out-of-state owner, and then the rest of it is pretty much all flood irrigation. There's a few center pivot irrigation, and we're very near sustainability according to the state with our groundwater. But that's because we're very inefficient with our irrigation. Half of the water goes back in the ground. So we're always putting half of our money back in the bank, so to speak. But because of that one large farm with an out-of-state owner, and these surface rights water owners drive by that when their creek is dry and they see those sprinklers running, when their water right is a senior water right and they don't have any water, that's a real problem. That's a social and cultural kind of problem that water law has a very difficult time dealing with. But that's where we are, is we have to sit down and resolve that among ourselves. And who is going to be dried up? if we just leave it to an economic model, the guy with the sprinklers has all the advantage. And so we have to be really careful about how we move forward here and how we set this up so that we don't just use economics and engineering. We have to decide what kind of a community do we want and what are we willing to do to create that. So I'm glad to be here in this point.
Thank you, George. Yeah, Jenny, go ahead, and we're into our last few minutes. So
Just 30
yeah,
seconds.
please.
I
Yeah.
completely agree with George. And I've said this so many times in Denver. The do nothing scenario is the person with the most money and the places with the most people get the water. That's a do nothing scenario. So what are we going to do from there, right? That's the hard part in there. But when I'm running a bill that's just running into headwaters all the time, it's and I said, okay, here's what's going to happen if we don't, and this might not be the right solution. I'm always been a fan of killing my own bills when they don't work or they're not right. But I totally agree with you, George. That's the reality. And if we just confront that reality right on and walk back from there, so what are we going to do to make sure that doesn't happen? The do nothing scenario, I think, is unacceptable.
Great, thanks. Last thoughts. Everybody else jump in here and offer any last thoughts you have based on the discussion or something you want to throw in here at the end. So Armando, you look like you've got something to say.
I've always got something to say, so that's not a problem. So if we just got a few minutes, for me, the thought is future oriented. It's got to be future oriented. There's an old adage that I learned, remember from a long age. It said, it's okay to look back, but don't stare. If you dwell on the back, you're never going to be able to impact what you do in the future. And I think that's where George and Jenny and Kelsey and James, we're all kind of hopefully, aligned in this area about how do we look forward while learning the valuable lessons from the past. But the future's got to be the key. And the way we did business, the way we held our communities, the way we utilized this resource in the past may not be the same strategy, may not be the same approach for the future. And we're already in different circumstances than we were 30, 40, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. We're in different situations. And so my biggest last perspective is we got to have that strategic approach. But in that strategic approach, we need to set up some benchmarks. We need to find ways to look for collaborative, hopefully win-win, but not everything can be win-win because there's probably going to be some trade-offs along the way. Nobody gets out of this, not everybody gets out of this without getting some hurt or impact or feeling some pain, but we need to find ways that how do we help our neighbor if they do feel that pain? One thing that Kelsey talked about these words and these definitions, and we talk about sustainability. And sustainability to me, and I don't know if this is a common definition that people want to work on or that we work on, is that we're able to use the current resource in the same manner, in the same way, at the same levels into perpetuity. That to me is some kind of sustainability. And I see all these little farms and ranches that used to survive on 40 acres, 80 acres. And now they're not even farmed, they either sold out because they couldn't make it. And so their sustainability is already long past. And we may not be able to do anything about their sustainability. But that doesn't mean, we jeopardize the current sustainability for something that did happen in the past. How do we look at that future? So I guess that's some of the lasting thoughts that I'll leave the panel, the group, the symposium attendees who are here today is how do we focus on, really strengthening on that strategic approach? What's the destination we want to get to? And how do we find some collective efforts to get there? But some of the toughest parts is agreeing on what that destination is, because people may have different destinations. And so they keep diverting onto different paths and we all end up at different places.
Thanks, Armando. James, and then Kelsey, and then anybody else who has a final thought. We're running a little bit over, but I want to hear from everybody else.
I will try to be brief. We have to operate within reality. We have to look at black and white numbers as we have part of this conversation. The values are very, very important, but we have to look at what's going on and understand the reality and understand it as a whole. And sometimes that's hard to step back from. Our family ranch goes back to 1882. My father-in-law recently retired and we rented his farm. So my wife and I have this kind of co-legacy going on that we want to leave an opportunity. And that's how we define sustainability, is leave an opportunity in the soil, in the water, in the economics to my 5 kids. The hard reality of that is not all 5 of them are going to get to do it just because of what the economics are. And that's get a little emotional when I think about that because of how much I love it. But you know, emotion is good. It's good for defining values, but we also have to operate in reality. And I just really encourage the community to come together and self-determine what the future of our water looks like, and then to go get and start implementing that track and create the structures to get there. Because Jenny's absolutely right. If we do nothing, it's going to be done to us. And that's not the people of the Valley. That's not the culture that we have. And so we just need to step up and really lean into that conversation.
Thanks, James. Kelsey?
One of the things that I have encountered in doing interviews around the state is the uniqueness of the San Luis Valley in terms of community and the way that different communities come together. It's, you know, community itself isn't unique, and people coming together certainly isn't unique. But one of the things that really struck me when I was doing interviews around the formation of the first subdistrict was how much people looked to the strengths of the past in the Valley around AWDI, and how that was really drawn from in terms of thinking, well, we can handle what's coming next because we've handled hard things before. And that is a legacy, certainly, that carries conversations like this forward. And I've also looked extensively into Crowley County and what happened there. And there was a lot of factors that came together that helped break that community apart. And it wasn't just the water purchase. You know, there was a lot of things that had to be in place for that community to fall apart. And part of that was the economic situation. And, you know, I can get way lost down that road there, but to pull myself back, you know, James is absolutely right. There's a lot of things that come together here and a lot of different factors that weigh in, and bringing all of these different parts of the conversation together are so key. But the San Luis Valley has a long history of coming together to kind of address these things. It's not easy. It's not pretty. It can be really nasty and really hard. But the challenge is certainly something that pulls people together and makes the Valley kind of unique in the state. So that as someone who's had the privilege to do interviews in other basins, the Rio Grande is often looked to as a place where, well, we can learn from them and how they've handled these situations. So just wanted to leave with that hopeful 2 cents.